Hello everyone, welcome back to our lecture series on the modern political history of Japan. And today we're going to be continuing our discussion of the post-war period, and especially we'll be starting from the time that we left off in our last lecture, which is right at the end of the Allied occupation of Japan. So in 1952, when Japanese sovereignty is restored, and all of the background to that, and then we'll be looking at the time period up until about the mid-1970s. And also in this talk, I'll cover, in addition to discussion of the political structure of Japan at this time, I'll be looking at some protest movements, some popular protest movements that sprung up in response to discontent with the way that the ruling political structure was set up. And then in addition, I'll be looking at I'll touch on the economic background of the time and some of the economic changes that took place. And then finally, I'll look at other forms of popular political engagement and Japan's foreign policy, especially in relation to the Vietnam War, the anti-nuclear movement, and Japan's relationship with a post-war relationship with Okinawa, and how that reflects interests as well between how it reflects Japan's relationship with the United States in particular. But Japan's relationship with the United States kind of looms large in the background throughout this lecture, as I think will become very clear during the course of the talk. One extra point to add in regards to the economy that I forgot to mention, in this talk I'll cover a period that's commonly known as the high growth period, or the economic high growth period in Japan. So heavy industry, especially, or the economy propelled by the revitalization of Japanese heavy industry, petrochemical industry especially, facilitated this so-called high growth period, this economic boom. And we'll look at some of the effects of that. Okay, so get started. So I've titled my talk today, Politics and Protest, Japan Post-1952. And I want to start by looking at the political structure. So just as some background information, I find it kind of helpful to have in the back of our minds, who is prime minister at any given time. And generally in the time period we're going to be talking about today, as I mentioned, from the end of the Allied occupation to about the mid-70s, these were all of the prime ministers during that time. So Yoshida Shigeru from 1948 to 1954 was with the Liberal Party. And then after this, these three especially were part of an anti-Yoshida faction that eventually toppled Yoshida and then joined their Democratic Party with the Liberal Party to form the Liberal Democratic Party. And the Liberal Democratic Party then has basically remained in power to this day, with a few short interludes where other opposition parties either managed to take control of the prime ministership, or through different coalitions were able to form some kind of meaningful opposition to the LDP. But basically, and especially in the time period we'll be looking at, it's been a period of just complete domination throughout the post-war by the LDP. But other notable than prime ministers from this time, so Hatoyama Ichido, Ishibashi Tanzan, Kishi Nobusuke we'll be talking a lot about, Ikeda Hayato, and then these three in particular oversaw the period of economic high growth initiated by Ikeda's income doubling plan, which I'll talk about momentarily, and Sato Eisaku and Tanaka Kakue as well. And then just looking at, continuing on with the political structure, the discussion of the political structure, when we look at the Diet itself and the makeup of the Diet in the lower house, between the period 1958 to 1969, some of the trends and changes that we see there. So again, LDP is by far the majority party, making up the majority of seats, but this is shared as well with the Japan Socialist Party. And this is the left faction of the socialists in Japan, and these were the two largest parties. So it had the appearance, then Japanese politics had the appearance of a two-party system, but in effect, the opposition was never prepared, never strong enough and never prepared to actually take the lead, as they were kind of content playing second fiddle the whole time. But the opposition was basically shared between these two groups. And then we also have the Democratic Socialist Party, which emerged a little bit later from around 1960. And this was due to a break with the Japan Socialist Party. This was the left faction of the socialists, and this was the right-wing faction of the socialists. But they never received too large of a portion of the seats. And then emerging even later is the Komeito, the Clean Government Party, who, as we know now, in contemporary times has formed, generally votes along the lines of the LDP and basically forms an alliance with them. But they maintain close ties, and their base actually is a religious sect, the Soka Gakkai. And then we have the Japan Communist Party, which was legalized after the war, but basically at first especially did not perform very well and took more of a revolutionary stance. So basically, thinking that change cannot be achieved simply through voting and representational politics, but eventually it altered that stance a bit and its stance toward the Diet, and began to gain more seats, and eventually even into the 1970s, then doubling its seats as well. Okay, but these were some of the basic changes then to the structure of the Diet. Some background for the talk then was the Korean War, which I touched on in the last discussion a little bit. So at this time, there was kind of a reverse course where the United States, in its vision for global hegemony, attempted to transform Japan into a bastion of liberal democracy in the Asia-Pacific as an eternal, unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Pacific from which it could always have military bases prepared to strike at potential, quote, enemies anywhere around Asia. And Japan was willing to provide the service. It didn't have too much of a choice, but some Japanese elites certainly did benefit from this as well, especially the Japanese heavy industry, and then vicariously the Japanese economy in general benefited from special war procurements, which meant that Japanese heavy industry companies were providing the materials and making the war materials basically, for the U.S. military through special contracts that they secured. In 1950, General MacArthur ordered the creation of the National Police Reserve. Now, this was partly, this is kind of seen as a start then of the self-defense forces. It's often pinpointed as one start for Japanese, quote, remilitarization. But again, note that the U.S. basically took the lead here in starting this, and its goal was to kind of offset some of the economic costs of policing Japan, because it had other things on its plate. It wanted to, be fully engaged in fighting abroad, essentially, and so it needed kind of domestic police force. Japan regained sovereignty under the 1952 San Francisco Treaty, and then immediately from this time, there is also a lot of efforts, not just at remilitarization, but also there's a general revival of nationalism. And nationalism, of course, had been lingering in the background as a convenient political tool that elites could mobilize and manipulate, or mobilize to manipulate the public. So elites, including the Emperor Yoshida, Shigeru, and successive prime ministers, diet members, etc., then they take this nationalism that had been kind of just waiting throughout the occupation period to be released. Essentially, they start to have some more overt displays of this. So, for instance, in 1952, the Showa Emperor and Empress attended a memorial service to the war dead at Yasukuni. The same year, the War Injured and War Bereaved Families Support Act was passed. In the occupation period, actually, the U.S. had eliminated the benefits from the state that people who had borne damages in the war would have received. Now, this probably wasn't totally a bad thing. It did lead to the construction of a number of kind of political advocacy groups, which then will pressure the state for more recognition of the war dead's sacrifices. And in the background of this partly is, a desire to be included in this support and pension system. In 1953, the military pension law was passed. This is basically a revival of wartime pensions. Now, wartime pensions, these would be handed out then especially, these are paid out by rank, essentially, in the military. So it's kind of a de facto way of restoring posthumously military rank upon the Japanese war dead. The same year, the Japan Association of War Bereaved Families, Nihon Izoku Kai, formed, again, as I mentioned, an advocacy group with close links to the state, and it was in their shared interest, basically, to support movements to, kind of positively portray the military wartime sacrifices. But at the same time, there were some points of contention occasionally, between over who should be receiving what kind of pension, and sometimes the Nihon Izoku Kai would, would argue that the government might be not doing enough or something like that. Also, 1952, the National Safety Agency Hoan Sho was formed. 1954, the Self-Defense Forces were formed. Around this time, the Anti-Subversive Activities Act was passed, as well as a textbook, as well as committees which were revived to review school textbooks. These were government committees. This becomes a problem later, especially in regards to how to remember and narrate the war in textbooks. There was a return of purged pre-war politicians such as Hatoyama Ichido, Ishibashi Tanzan, Kishi Nobusuke, all who later became prime minister and who we'll be talking about throughout this lecture. They had all been held as war criminals after the war. Hatoyama, Ishibashi, and Kishi formed the Japan Democratic Party, and then later, as I mentioned, this merges with the Liberal Party to form the Liberal Democratic Party. They openly called for constitutional revision, rearmament, and an end to dependence on the U.S. we have this idea, I think, sometimes in contemporary, when studying contemporary Japan, that there's this kind of growing right-wing trend within Japanese politics to more overt demands to revise the constitution, and politicians such as Abe, for instance, are often perceived as kind of anomalous within the Japanese political system, as kind of, being especially nationalistic or something, but I would argue this is not the case. Rather, this has been, they've pretty much called for the same thing from the very beginning of the post-war, and their goals haven't really changed that much. Perhaps in certain respects becoming a bit more, how would I say, kind of strengthening repressive state apparatuses, yes, certainly in that regard. But in terms of constitutional revision, rearmament, many of the goals have remained unchanged. And then moving on just to discuss a little bit in more detail about the LDP and the 1955 sentiment. As I mentioned, there was support for the left-wing party, left-wing branch of the Socialist Party, and they formed the main opposition party throughout this time period. And a lot of this in the background, the support for them, came from a strong anti-war sentiment among the populace and opposition to rearmament and even different forms of nationalism that I just mentioned. So they were kind of, the progressive then left-wing party at the time, and they gained eventually in 1955 1/3 of the Diet seats. The conservatives, meanwhile, as I already said, the Liberal and Democratic parties merged into the Liberal Democratic Party, giving rise to the two-party system. But again, the opposition was never strong enough to take over, so it was really only the appearance of a two-party system. Kishi Nobusuke, when he was prime minister, he rammed through the U.S. Security Treaty revision in 1960, but this prompted a huge backlash, eventually forcing him to resign. And after Kishi resigned, Ikeda Hayato took over, and he adopted a more conciliatory stance toward the political opposition, focused on the economy rather than constitutional revision, and garnered popular support through his income doubling plan. We'll talk about each of these things in more detail as we move on. Later, Prime Minister Sato Eisaku oversaw the normalization of relations with Korea in 1965, the reversion of Okinawa to the mainland in 1972, and he also avoided controversial issues like constitutional revision, deciding instead to focus on the economy to bolster his popularity and the popularity of the LDP in general. Sato was re-elected as LDP president 4 times, and previously, until Abe Shinzo, this was the longest reigning prime minister in modern Japanese history. Meanwhile, the JSP was not a very good opponent because it basically benefited from the same system that it was supposed to criticize, and it would take oppositional stances to the LDP on issues such as the Vietnam War and pollution, but these themselves were never enough to topple the LDP, since it's just picking up on these issues without really kind of formulating a grand scheme, I guess, or plan. And it failed to rally its supporters as well. Instead, what did happen was that the number of opposition parties increased. So the right wing, as I mentioned, broke from the JSP and formed the Democratic Socialist Party. In the United States today, we have a kind of, when people hear Democratic Socialist, many people have a kind of positive image, but in this case in Japan, the Democratic Socialists were the right wing socialists. But it fielded 105 candidates, but only 17 were elected, so this remained rather marginal. The Clean Government Party Komeito ran in the 1967 elections, and by 1969, it had become the second largest opposition party, so third largest party overall. but it was limited by its connections to the new religion Soka Gakkai, in English, the value-creating society. As I mentioned, the JCP had lost its seats in 1952 due to its revolutionary stance, but it modified this later and made gains from 1955. In 1969, tripled the number of its seats to 14, and in 1972, gained 38 seats in the Diet. Since the LDP was in power for so long, however, the fight basically became not between opposition parties, but between factions within the LDP itself. So by the time of the Ikeda Sato years, almost every LDP politician belonged to a faction, which even had physical offices, staff, etc. And one of the biggest reasons for this was, in addition to this one-party dominance and hegemony, was electoral districts themselves. In each constitution, there were about 3 to 5 candidates. Many times the opposition couldn't field enough candidates in each district, but the LDP would have many. So they would just battle out between themselves. And as Kitaoka Shinichi says in the text that we read as a background to this lecture, rather than trying to appeal to voters of different ideological or policy persuasions, my quote has disappeared, the conservative candidates tended to eat into each other's base. Another reason for the factionalism within the LDP was that the number of cabinet members grew from 7 to 9 in the pre-war to about 21 in the post-war. And all of these would typically go to LDP Diet members. So LDP politicians are then competing for other lucrative positions within the party itself, including the chairman of the General Council, director of finance, speakers of House of Representatives or House of Councilors, or the heads of various standing committees, etc. And LDP politicians would try to position themselves next to the candidate that they thought would be likely to win, and thus get lucrative posts. There's also the emergence of what's sometimes called the iron triangle between the LDP business and bureaucracy. So the business community provided political funds for politicians to run their campaigns. The bureaucracy would prepare the policies, and the LDP, in Kitaoka's words, provided the capitalist order for the economic world to function, and for the bureaucracy the necessary political guarantees to implement their policies. And when bureaucrats retired, they were given positions in the LDP or business community, and this is known as the descent from heaven, or amakudari in Japanese. The LDP relied especially on policy recommendations of the bureaucracy, and the links between the bureaucracy and the LDP politicians meant that the LDP developed a monopoly on expert knowledge to craft policy, which many times the opposition parties lacked, because the bureaucracy is so has such a vested interest in LDP politicians, and their connections between them are so close. The LDP then served as the facilitator between the business community and the bureaucracy. So it's just adopting policies, passing laws, etc., that are going to be favorable to the business community, and all of these policies themselves have been crafted by the bureaucracy, which has in turn been influenced by the business community. Kitaoka noted the, quote, denigrating of the ordinary citizen in this process, as well as the, quote, bureaucratization of the Japanese state, in which the Diet becomes, quote, a mere facade. So, by the way, this is Kitaoka Shinichi writing in a recently translated textbook on Japanese political history into English about post-war Japanese politics in general. So, this is a quite astounding quote, I think, actually. He doesn't, this is not a very high evaluation of the role of the Diet already from the beginning in post-war Japan. I want to look at then, partly because of this denigrating of the ordinary citizen, obviously then, as we saw in the pre-war period as well, when people become disenfranchised from the system, when they feel that they their voice is not being heard, when their ideas are not being reflected at the state level, then there's going to be opposition. When other means have failed, this frequently results in protests, in demonstrations, and sometimes even in riots. And one of the largest, well, certainly the largest demonstration during this time period that we're looking at was the Anti-Onboard, what is known as the Anti-Onboard Movement. And Onbo stands for Anzen Hosho Joyaku in Japanese. I'll show you the English translation in a minute. But as background for this lecture, then in my class, we've also read a short text on this, so I'll be drawing a lot from this. Okay, so Kishi Nobusuke became prime minister in 1957, and as I mentioned, he was seeking constitutional revision as well as kind of revising and renewing the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. He wanted to strengthen this relationship between the U.S. and Japan in a way that he thought was more favorable to Japan, but would be more strongly based on, what he would term as friendship between the two countries. But they both have the same, in a way, kind of the same worldview, which is strongly anti-communist. And both Japan and Japanese conservative leaders and U.S. conservative leaders have a vested interest in the U.S. military being in Japan. So I want to state that from the outset. So he's not trying to revise it to get them out of Japan, to get U.S. forces out of Japan. He's trying to revise it to strengthen those bonds, rather. So this is where then a lot of opposition emerges. A little bit of background to Kishi himself. He joined the Ministry of Commerce and Industry in 1925. In 1936, he entered the Manchukuo government's Industrial Bureau as deputy director, thus playing a role in directing the Manchurian economy. As we've seen a little bit already about how the Japanese state in the pre-war exploited Manchurian labor and resources throughout this time that Kishi was overseeing the Manchurian economy. He was also vice minister in the Commerce and Industry during the Tojo Hideki cabinet, and subsequently its minister. In the post-war, then, he was arrested as a Class A war criminal and held in Sugamo prison, but he was released in 1948. Then he helped Prime Minister Hatoyama form the Japan Democratic Party in 1954. And, however, there was strong opposition to Kishi then. So moving back then to the background for the Anti-Onboard movements themselves. There's strong opposition to Kishi because the right, the Japanese right, part of the right wanted to scrap the Onpo in general, and Onpo here is, as I said, Anzen Hosho Joyaku, taking the an from Anzen, and Hosho, this can also be read as po, when it's just the Chinese character, so Onpo. In Japanese, it's just U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, something like this. The left felt that the treaty revision was a threat to democracy, and they feared remilitarization that might occur under it, and also Japan becoming implicitly involved in wars, which it already had been in the Korean War and was later in the Vietnam War. Others themselves just feared Kishi's wartime past, as we've already described, him being convicted as a war criminal. So Kishi wanted to pass revision by the time that U.S. President Eisenhower was scheduled to visit on June 19th, 1960. However, the main opposition party, on May 19th, the Japan Socialist Party, many politicians from the JSP barricaded the hallways of the Diet to prevent a vote from taking place. Now, this was supposed to be not a vote on the legislation, it was supposed to be a vote to extend the Diet session from taking place. But as we'll see, Kishi very strategically used this opportunity as well to pass the legislation itself. The LDP eventually called 500 police officers at 11 p.m. to forcefully expel the JSP Diet members. This was all done on live NHK broadcasts with people watching this on TV or listening to it on the radio. After this, it was only LDP members remaining in the Diet, and they called for a vote at midnight and voted to extend the Diet session. But minutes later, Kishi called for a vote on the legislation itself, and the vote passed, obviously, because all of the opposition had just been forcefully removed from the Diet just minutes earlier. So this is a very strategic thing. But clearly there's no real actual vote going on here. So this was seen as being incredibly undemocratic, using police to expel Diet members from the Diet. So protests broke out all over. The Labor Federation Sohyo organized 3 massive general strikes in June on the 4th, 15th, and 22nd. Nick Kapoor, who has studied and written extensively about this period, and who's an article by whom we read, wrote that this was less of an anti-treaty movement and more of an anti-Kishi movement. The media also turned on Kishi, while the business community became concerned about the effects of continuing strikes, demonstrating, as we've seen in the pre-war, the effectiveness of strikes when they're used in tandem with demands for political change and democratic enfranchisement. There was also opposition then to Eisenhower's planned visit itself, since this was supposed to occur on the same day that the treaty would be ratified. So 6,000 protesters went to Haneda Airport when Eisenhower's aide, James Hagerty, landed there on June 10th. Before Eisenhower had, actually visited. So it's not Eisenhower, it's James Hagerty and then 2 others in the car. And the 6,000 protesters then block the car from leaving the airport. Riot police are dispatched, and they battle with the protesters. And the 3 men who were in the car actually eventually had to be evacuated by U.S. Marines helicopter. So you can also see how the U.S. Security Treaty allowing U.S. troops to be deployed into Japan to dispel domestic riots is already being, in a way, employed here. And then later, U.S. documents revealed that the car had deliberately driven into the crowd anyway in order to kind of provoke them and to provoke some kind of incident and I don't know, perhaps to, make these, quote, kind of left-wing radicals look worse, but this kind of backfired. Then there were bloody clashes at the Diet on June 15th. Sohyo organized the second general strike that day with 6.4 million workers striking, and shops closed in Tokyo and around the country. At 5 p.m., protesters were attacked by right-wing counter-protesters from the Imperial Restoration Action Corps, the Ishin Kodotai. They attacked with wooden posts with nails in them. Attackers yelled that they would kill the protesters, and 80 people were injured and hospitalized in the process, who had been, violently attacked by these right-wingers. Then were left radical students eventually smashed through the Diet South Gate. The police fell back temporarily, and students, gave the space over to students who gave speeches and sang songs. Then after 7 p.m., the police launched a counterattack. And during this time, Tokyo University undergrad Kamba Michiko was trampled to death. And this is seen as an instance of extreme police brutality, and so this kind of even incites the students more, who then eventually attack the main gate of the Diet. At 1 a.m., the police again attacked the students with batons and tear gas. Students were beaten unconscious and carried away in ambulances. Misspell here. Students set 18 police vehicles on fire at this time. And the death of Kamba Michiko shocked the nation, since especially she was a woman, and she was from an upper middle class background and was the daughter of a university professor. The next day, the head of police told Kishi that he was not confident that police could protect Eisenhower when he came to visit. on his scheduled trip. This outraged Kishi, who said, well, then he's going to call in the SDF. But the head of the defense agency, Akagi Munemori, opposed this. The SDF, again, had only rather recently been formed. So Kishi was forced to give in and postpone Eisenhower's visit, with he himself resigning the next day. Protests continued, though, on June 18th, the largest protest yet, with 330,000 protesting in Tokyo alone. Note this is one day before the security treaty revision is scheduled to automatically come into effect. But eventually their ultimate goal of blocking the treaty was unsuccessful. But anyway, this is just kind of, I think, a nice example, and it's frequently studied as an example of Japanese political protest, of kind of progressive and left movements of opposition to militarism. People's wartime memories at this time, for many people, were still fresh, and that's often pointed out in scholarship on this topic as kind of fueling and aiding people's anti-war sentiment. Kishi's wartime background, as I mentioned already, is frequently pointed out as being the source of a particular antagonism toward Kishi himself. So this idea of remilitarization, of kind of return to wartime militarization, is still very strong in Japanese society at the time, and this was one factor, I think, driving these protests. Of course, the desire not to be dragged back into war because of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, which Japan already had been, as I mentioned, during the Korean War, and would continue to be through the Vietnam War, as well as, Kishi's so-called undemocratic actions of forcefully expelling Diet members from the Diet, etc. And so this is kind of a response to people feeling like politics is not working for them. Okay, let's look at economic growth and some economic policy next. And so I already mentioned this iron triangle, of this connection between LDP politicians, business community, and bureaucracy. And I kind of want to look at how this actually functioned and what some of the effects of this were. This time period that we're looking at was in general a period of high growth around the world, with growth rates of approximately 5%, GDP rising 5% annually. In 1952, the Japanese government passed the law for the acceleration of rationalization of enterprises, which reduced corporate taxes, gave government subsidies and loans to key industries, accelerated depreciation, so companies could write off depreciation as a loss in their first year in return for lower taxes. And these things helped spark this economic boom as companies embarked on bolder capital investment. The government protected key industries such as the car companies by regulating imports. In 1953, there was revision to the anti-monopoly law to allow for cartels, eased restrictions on cross-holding shares, etc. And a system of administrative guidance developed under which the Ministry of International Trade and Industry advised key industries while the Bank of Japan regulated the money supply. Self-financing of companies was replaced in favor of borrowing, as borrowing became easier and the money supply was increased. The Bank of Japan lended to banks, which then lent to companies, to private banks, which lent to companies. And much of this as well, of the borrowing, was funded through the rise in households' bank savings. So all of this kind of provided a way to finance this growth of Japanese industry and companies. Looking at labor then, there was still large wage gap between large and small corporations, wage gaps between men and women, and part and full-time employment. Large companies would often subcontract out to smaller companies since their wages were lower, and this would result in lower overhead costs for the company in general. In the early post-war there was the Japan Confederation of Labor, Sodomy, which had links with the right-wing faction of the JSP. This is a major labor labor union, and the Congress of Industrial Labor Unions of Japan, Sambetsu, which was closely tied to the JCP. In 1950, opponents of Sambetsu formed the General Council of Trade Unions of Japan, Sohyo, and Sohyo combined strikes with political activism, as we've already seen a little bit in the anti-Onboard demonstrations and the discussion on that. From around 1955, unions adopted a policy of what was known as a spring labor offensive, where they would seek annual wage increases in the spring. This was partly to reap more of the economic benefits as the Japanese economy boomed, and as well a way to keep up, of course, with inflation, itself resulting in different types of, probably propelling different types of inflation anyway. In the 1950s, labor relations, pattern of labor relations emerged, which is based on age-based seniority, lifelong employment, and company unions. Eventually compromises were reached in which companies would grant wage increases while workers then promised to limit the lengths of their strikes. So there's kind of this compromise then, convenient compromise between labor and capital, where they realize that the success of the company is actually in both of their best interests, paradoxically, or at least it would appear that way from the perspective of many unions. Meanwhile, workers in key industries like energy, such as coal miners, had increased power over the national and global economy. Now, this is because up until this time, Japan has still been very much relying on coal as its main energy source, and this eventually changes. But coal miners in these key industries then realize they have a lot of power over the global and national economy because they control, in a way, the energy supply. So if they strike, for instance, they can demand not only higher wages, but can also make increased political demands. And this is something that we see throughout control of energy in the history, in global economic history as well. And so the Mike coal mine dispute in 1959-1960, for instance, was a very important labor dispute there because these miners, realized kind of the extent of their own power. But as a result, and partly to break up the power of workers and to remove their ability to make political demands, especially, the government switched from coal to oil. And oil, one of the benefits of oil, for instance, is that it's not produced or manufactured in Japan. It's all imported, right? So the labor force is all abroad. There's no domestic labor force in regards to oil. So there's no domestic labor force to demand higher wages, demand political change in the Japanese economy. It's all abroad, exploitation of cheap labor abroad, and then combined in tandem with the suppression of labor rights and political rights of oil workers abroad. But oil itself requires less workers in general. It doesn't require people to go down into mines and dig it out and then to physically haul it around. It can be basically automatically pumped out of the ground and then shipped through pipelines. So oil around the world in global economic history was a very convenient way for capital to break the power of labor. Oil imports subsequently rose while domestic coal production and use declined. And then we start on a period of high growth through the 1960s. So, as I mentioned earlier, Prime Minister Ikeda in 1960 introduced his National Income Doubling Plan, which sought to double incomes and the GDP in a decade. He called for 7% annual economic growth rate. In fact, the actual growth rate in the 1950s and 60s averaged 10%, which is a huge amount, although there were large fluctuations. Now, of course, this was partly a strategic attempt on his part to depoliticize the populace and to regain support for the LDP in the wake of the Anti-Onboard movement. And this was largely successful. Ikeda also liberalized trade, reduced restrictions on imports, liberalized the flow of capital as well. And Japan became an Article 8 IMF member in 1964. So throughout this, we see interesting combinations of kind of Keynesian economic policies combined with what would later become known as types of neoliberal economic policies, liberalizing flows of capital, making it easier for foreign investments to flow into Japan, for capital to move across borders, as we saw with Japanese companies moving abroad and shifting of the energy supply. At the same time, the state facilitating the role of this through the passing of different legislation, through the passing of legislation which favors businesses, lowering taxes, making it easier to liberalize trade and flows of capital. There's also different kinds of government oversight, though, over the economy and government investment and strategic support for key industries, which is kind of suggests a more Keynesian approach to economics at this time. Japan also then constructed national expressways all over the country and the Shinkansen to open before the 1964 Tokyo Olympics. And this is kind of seen as then Japan's, the high point of not only Japanese growth, but also it's kind of the success of Japan's recovery from the war and full reintegration into the global community and global economy as not just a player, but a key and dominant player in the global economy as well. I want to shift gears a little bit, but I think we'll see a lot of interesting connections and overlaps and also nuances on the political and economic situation when we look at the examples of what can broadly be termed kind of an anti-war movement, and they all approach the issue from different perspectives, but in Hiroshima, and this is, I say Hiroshima here, I also mean, of course, Nagasaki. This is referring to anti-nuclear policies and advocacy, and then responses to the Vietnam War, and then finally Japan's relationship to Okinawa. So first, the anti-nuclear movement. Background to this is the nuclear arms race between the US and USSR, to a lesser extent China, France, and other countries. The US tested a hydrogen bomb, so where this really then comes to affect Japan at a visceral level for many average people is in 1954, when the US tested the largest hydrogen bomb to be tested yet in the Bikini Atoll, which had, and the bomb itself was 1,000 times as powerful as the atomic bomb dropped over Hiroshima. And this rained radiation down not only on Pacific Islanders, but also on a Japanese fishing boat, the Lucky Dragon No. 5, Daigo Fukuryumaru, which was showered with radiation. One of the members of the crew actually died. Many others became sick from radiation sickness. And this was widely covered in the Japanese media. It prompted a huge fear of radiation in fish stocks and fish supplies that were being fished and that were being consumed by Japanese consumers. And it prompted a huge anti-nuclear movement in Japan, with 32 million people signing petitions to ban nuclear weapons shortly after this. And it led to the first World Congress against atomic and hydrogen bombs in Hiroshima in 1955. Okay, so to counteract this kind of popular movement against nuclear weapons. Now, the United States is certainly not prepared to give up its nuclear arsenal, certainly at this point, and Japan wants to oblige the United States. Japan itself is benefiting from the U.S. nuclear umbrella. So Japanese media and business elite, along with the U.S. government, launched, and this is around the world globally as well, the Atoms for Peace, a movement to promote the, quote, peaceful uses of nuclear power in Japan. And media, business elite, and U.S. government members held a traveling exhibit on the peaceful, quote, peaceful uses of nuclear power, even in Hiroshima, to try to convince people that nuclear power is safe. Yeah, sure, nuclear weapons, they seem kind of dangerous, but nuclear power itself, the idea of nuclear power itself, can be very good. This is the idea that they're trying to promote. It can lead to peaceful sources of energy. So they're trying to change this image of nuclear power, which people had associated just with nuclear weapons as being very bad and negative, to something good and positive. And then the side effects of that, of course, would be to, it's part of a propaganda strategy to take the focus off the nuclear arms race and to diffuse the Japanese anti-nuclear movement. And their efforts, amazingly, were largely successful. Even to the point where many hibakusha, many A-bomb victims in Japan became supporters of nuclear power. And this idea that nuclear power is safe was very strong then throughout the post-war in Japan up until the 2011, the March nuclear disaster in 2011. And when finally this kind of myth was shattered, that nuclear power too is very dangerous and produces victims and produces more hibakusha. The Japanese companies and governments, though, and so there's also, it's not just a political interest of taking the focus off of the nuclear arms race, but it's also a business interest where Japanese businesses and heavy industries are interested in profiting from nuclear power. So Japanese companies and the government invested in tandem with U.S. companies, invested in nuclear power plants. In 1955, the Atomic Energy Basic Law was established along with the Japan Atomic Energy Commission. And by 1957, the Japanese government had contracted to buy 20 nuclear reactors. And then this, nuclear energy itself has a continuing history in post-war Japan. I mentioned the Fukushima nuclear disaster, but throughout this history, though, there have been many other actually smaller disasters and victims of radiation being produced. But this is for another talk. Then looking at the Vietnam War, very briefly, background to this: in 1955 to 1975 is a conflict between these decades-long anti-colonial and pro-independence movement, and part of a civil war that became a proxy conflict in the Cold War between the U.S., which supported South Vietnam and Ngo Dinh Diem, while China and the USSR supported the North, Ho Chi Minh, and the Viet Cong. In 1965, U.S. President Lyndon Johnson escalated the war, and within 3 years there were more than 500,000 U.S. troops fighting in Vietnam. U.S. bombers launched from bases in Japan and Okinawa devastated Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, destroying populations and the environment there. And the war was hugely unpopular in both the U.S. and Japan. But Prime Minister Sato supported the war for different reasons, partly to reduce bilateral trade friction with the United States, as well as to secure control over Okinawa. He would provide support for the U.S. military in return for the eventual return of Okinawa, which he saw as kind of a symbolic move to strengthen Japan and to strengthen his image in Japan. The mass media, like the Asahi Shimbun, were greatly opposed to the Vietnam War. Writer Honda Katsuichi reported on the war, and at the time it was popular to make connections between the Vietnam War, between the U.S.'s role in the Vietnam War, and between Japan's historical role as a colonizer invading China during World War II. And this was emphasized, for instance, or illustrated, for instance, between when Honda Katsuichi reported not only on the Vietnam War, but also at this time wrote Travels in China, a series in which, through interviews of Chinese survivors of Japanese aggression, wartime aggression, exposed Japanese war crimes in China. So trying to kind of link these images between the U.S.'s role in Vietnam and Japan's historical role in China. Intellectuals like Oda Makoto formed Beiheiren, which opposed the war and U.S. bases in Japan, and helped U.S. soldiers who were stationed in Japan to desert. And there was a popular conception, as I mentioned, that Vietnam was like the Japanese military invasion of China, and that now Japan was again helping to victimizing Asians by helping the U.S. Fight the Vietnam War. A 1965 Asahi poll found that 75% of the Japanese population disapproved of U.S. bombing of Indochina. Only 4% approved. However, the main reason, as Thomas Havens wrote in his in-depth study on this topic, that for opposition in Japan was fears that Japan might be drawn into the war, he writes. But Havens also argues and shows that the Vietnam War did not really affect domestic politics in Japan. The LDP still did relatively well in the upper house elections in July 1965, and the Vietnam War was hardly an issue for candidates at this time. Their support in conservative rural areas remained strong, and there was a lack of interest in alternative candidates and parties. For many people, the war was too far away and didn't concern them domestically. It was, in Havens' words, a fire across the sea. But nevertheless, there was this popular anti-war movement, which I don't think we should dismiss and write off. And in fact, the reason why I'm bringing up these examples is to kind of show points of overlap between them, how anti-nuclear movements, anti-Vietnam War movements, and some movements in Okinawa, as we'll see in a minute, were all kind of, in a way, connected into a broader political movement, popular movements, and pushes for, I would say, greater democratic control and freedoms in Japan. Okay, so moving on to Okinawa. Okinawa was under U.S. military control between 1945 to 1972. And within Okinawa at the time, very early on, there was a popular conception that the U.S. had basically rescued the island from Japanese militarism and imperialism. So the U.S. was initially welcomed, and some in Okinawa thought that perhaps even this might be a way to seek eventual Okinawan independence. However, the U.S. was basically just concerned in holding on to Okinawa as a military base to secure its hegemony, its global hegemony, and it sought to exploit tensions between Okinawans and Japanese, historical and ongoing tensions. So the U.S. leaders, for instance, emphasized Ryukyuan independence and this historical narrative that the Ryukyuan kingdom had been completely independent from Japan, which was not entirely the case. There are more important nuances, I think, and connections here that are greatly glossed over in this U.S. narrative. And the main aim of the U.S. again was to exploit these tensions to kind of prevent unified opposition movement from forming so that it could hold on to Okinawa, to control of Okinawa longer. However, calls for reversion grew from around 1951 and 1952. Some in Okinawa wanted to benefit from the high economic growth that was underway in the Japanese mainland that was not really reaching Okinawa. So they saw this as reversion as a way to strengthen the Okinawan economy. And many people resented the harsh and undemocratic U.S. military rule, for example, the seizure of Okinawan land without compensation to build military bases and runways for U.S. bombers. On events like the 1955 rape and murder of a young Okinawan girl by U.S. troops strengthened opposition to the U.S. in Okinawa. The soldiers were not punished due to extraterritoriality. The U.S. denounced the pro-reversion movement, however, or just totally wrote it off as a, quote, communist plot. So it refused to even engage with protesters' legitimate concerns. Some in the Okinawan pro-reversion movement also adopted the language of Japanese nationalism. Maybe this might seem paradoxical, but this, in a way, I think is a natural effect of this very repressive U.S. military rule. And reversion to Japan seems so appealing to many people at this time that they, in Okinawa, that they pick up on, they purposely raise the Japanese flag, for instance, which was outlawed in Japan, in Okinawa, sorry, for much of the U.S. military occupation. They would kind of purposely adopt these symbols of Japanese nationalism to make a political point of opposition to U.S. military rule. But Japanese conservative politicians and groups exploited and supported this. Many emphasized the shared Japaneseness of Okinawans and used this to beautify Okinawa in World War II war deaths as patriotic sacrifices to the state, which in most times they were not. There was a lot of, people were forcefully made to fight during the war. But during the Vietnam War, many Okinawan progressives eventually dropped these kind of nationalistic overtones in favor of general anti-war stances, and formed, connections with anti-war movements in mainland Japan as well. Meanwhile, the LDP is seeking to, and Prime Minister Sato are seeking to benefit from what they see as the imminent return or reversion of Okinawa to mainland Japan, and to kind of write this off as one of their political successes. So in 1966 and 7, the LDP doubled aid to Okinawa, easily surpassing U.S. aid. This continued year by year. Meanwhile, the U.S. became unable to afford aid to Okinawa since it was preoccupied by the Vietnam War, and it also needed Japan to take on a greater role in Okinawa. So there was this kind of shift in the balance of power and interest over control in Okinawa that decidedly shifted in favor of reversion to Japan. So in 1969, secret communique between Prime Minister Sato and Nixon revealed plans to return Okinawa to the mainland, but to keep U.S. military bases there. The U.S. had already decided to withdraw from Vietnam, and it wanted to save more money by reverting administrative control to Japan. Also, U.S. and Chinese relations had improved during this time, so this as well kind of lessened some of the reasons, the background reasons, to hold on to Okinawa, at least direct political control. Meanwhile, the U.S. had kept 1,300 nuclear weapons on Okinawa, violating at least Japanese law, during the height of the Vietnam War, and greatly putting the Okinawan population at risk. But later the U.S. developed nuclear submarines and ICBMs that allowed for a greater range of nuclear weapons, and the need to store so many of them in Okinawa decreased. So there were these practical, realist military reasons as well for the U.S. eventually relinquishing control of Okinawa. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Sato called for the 3 non-nuclear principles and denuclearization of Okinawa. In fact, however, it was U.S. pressure. It was the U.S. that pressured Japan to adopt this stance because it was pushing countries to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty, in which it would have hegemonic control over nuclear weapons. Moreover, the LDP adopted nuclear power and reactors capable of making nuclear weapons at any time. And meanwhile, the Japanese government signed an agreement with the U.S. to approve entry of nuclear-armed ships and free use of bases. So basically, then, Prime Minister Sato is these kind of non-nuclear principles, these 3 non-nuclear principles. Sometimes these were hailed at the time and still are as, kind of evidence of Japan's very anti-nuclear stance, but this was really actually not the case. This was a strategic attempt by Japanese political leaders, conservative political leaders, to make it seem like they adopted a rhetoric of anti-nuclearism, when in fact this was just to distract from what they're actually doing, which was supporting the U.S.'s ongoing use of nuclear weapons and secretly approving the entry of nuclear-armed ships into Japan. The government of Japan also paid for U.S. bases on Okinawa and the disarmament of the U.S. military there with Japanese taxpayer money, and it maintained the status of forces agreement, which continued to give U.S. extraterritoriality there. Meanwhile, U.S. military bases were reduced in mainland Japan, but not in Okinawa. and this continues to this day. Moreover, Okinawa struggled with little representation in the Diet, high unemployment, underdeveloped industry, and low university entrance rates. So it was a great gap, a disparity between how Okinawans were being treated and how mainland Japanese were being treated. Okinawa bearing the brunt of the burden of U.S. military bases and not really getting anything in return in terms of democratic enfranchisement or boosting the economy in a meaningful way. So in conclusion, I want to then just kind of reflect on what I think are some of kind of the key threads running through this talk and our discussion of the post-war period and politics and economics in Japan at this time. First, post-1952, Japanese politics and economics developed around a tightly knit bond of business, political, and bureaucratic elites. Second, economic growth frequently distracted from the undemocratic nature of capitalist politics, but in times of crisis, such as what we saw in the Ampo demonstrations, the Lucky Dragon incident in the Vietnam War, popular discontent arose and often spilled over into the streets. And third, other problems of capitalist development would also later emerge, for instance, as we'll see in a following lecture, issues of industrial pollution. And the depoliticization of the public sphere would advance under future neoliberal reforms, as we'll see in a couple lectures from today. Okay, that's the end of my talk, looking at this very interesting time period in post-war Japanese history. Again, as an historian, I always am interested in the ongoing effects of all of these things for our current political situation today. And I hope some of these things are becoming apparent through these talks and are kind of broadening our understanding of contemporary politics through this historical view. So thank you very much for listening.